Hi, everyone. Welcome to our web-based workshop today. My name is Michael Grant, and I'm with ICF. And today we will be talking about effective methods for setting transportation performance targets. With support from staff at ICF and our partners at High Street Consulting and Applied Pavement Technology, I was involved and our team led this study for the National Cooperative Highway Research Program, project number 2307. Today, I'm joined by Anna Battista from High Street, who will be also co-facilitating, along with Sarah Lettuce and Haley Eggert from ICF, who will be providing technical support for the meeting today. We also have two great panelists, Deanna Belden from Minnesota DOT and Edgardo Block from Connecticut DOT, who will provide some of their perspectives today on lessons learned on target setting methods and effective practices. Today's workshop is the final workshop in a series of 6 web-based workshops that we've held as part of this study, with the purpose to raise awareness of the results of the research effort, which is culminating in a guidebook on effective methods for setting transportation performance targets. It should also provide useful information to help transportation practitioners understand effective methods for setting performance targets, how to implement these methods, and issues to consider in selecting a method, drawing on the research conducted through this study. And today we also want, through this series, to help transportation practitioners engage in dialogue on target setting methods and learn from the results of the study and from each other. The workshop will review some of the key takeaways from the guidebook and lessons learned that have come up throughout the workshop series. Just as a quick agenda, we have a 2-hour session today. This is the final workshop in our series on effective methods for setting transportation performance targets. And today we'll cover a brief overview of methods. Some may have touched on this if you've participated in some of the prior sessions, but we'll provide a very brief overview of that. Then we'll hear from 2 of our panelists, Deanna Belden and Edgardo Block, about their experiences with target setting within their states and some of the lessons they have to share. And we'll provide some observations on issues associated with target setting. We'll talk beyond the methods themselves about some of the philosophies used in setting targets, from aspirational to more conservative target setting. And we will conclude with some tips about selecting methods and making the process more effective. This session today is meant to be interactive, and we want to hear from you. It's not just a simple webinar, but we want to make this a real workshop that's virtual. So we hope to hear from you and get your questions, comments, and interaction throughout the workshop. So I'm going to pass it to Sarah to explain a little bit more about the Zoom navigation.
Hi, so first I just want to note that this workshop will be recorded, and I'll also share a few tips for navigating the Zoom platform. So to view closed captions, look for the CC button at the bottom of the screen and select Show Subtitle. After each of our speakers and at the end of the workshop, there will be time for questions. And so as questions come up throughout the workshop, feel free to drop them in the chat or raise your hand. The chat and hand raise buttons can both be found at the bottom of the screen. And when you raise your hand, one of the facilitators will give you the ability to unmute. If you have any questions on how to use Zoom, feel free to send a chat or reach out to the emails that we've posted in the chat. I'll turn it back to Michael now. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Sarah. So just as a little bit of background on the study purpose for this NCHRP project, state DOTs and MPOs together through the federal requirements have needed to establish targets for each of the national performance measures. And we recognize that target setting is often challenging for many reasons. Through the research and just experience working within the industry, we've seen a number of technical issues. These include having limited historical data, data consistency and quality issues, and then even more recently, issues like the COVID, which have created disruptive changes in trends. The chart actually on the right-hand side of here shows even looking at a historical trend, if you're looking back a few years, 2-year trend, 5-year trend, 10-year trend, the trends may look different based on that data available. Now we layer in issues like COVID and changes in system performance and issues, And we recognize that setting a target for a performance area is not simple. And through this study, we've looked at a range of different methods that can be used to help to support that process of setting targets. In addition to some of the quantitative issues, we've also seen communications issues and challenges about what to do when performance is not moving in a desired direction, as well as concerns about missing a target and the challenges that agencies face. So there are a wide array of issues faced in setting targets. And the purpose of this study was to help develop and disseminate a guidebook on methods that provide useful information on how to set targets for the different performance areas, as well as some of the tips and lessons learned for making that process effective. The guidebook itself explores 5 categories of measures. These are related to the measures required by the Federal Highway Administration as national performance measures. The study did not specifically explore the CMAQ on-road mobile source emissions measure. And it's interesting to note that most recently, Federal Highway Administration released a notice of proposed rulemaking on adding a greenhouse gas performance measure for the national highway system. This document focuses primarily on these 5 performance areas, but it does recognize that there are other performance areas and issues, and actually addresses greenhouse gases as well as some other types of measures that agencies may be interested in considering. The guidebook itself is organized into 3 parts. Part 1 provides an overview of target setting methods and considerations associated with target setting for the national performance measures. And it describes target setting philosophies and a range of sophistication and methods, as well as challenges and elements of effective methods and tips. The second part of the document is the bulk of the guide and includes a menu of target setting methods that can be considered specific to individual performance areas. And the third part includes a discussion of performance measures beyond the federal requirements. It talks about reasons that other performance measures and targets may be set and provides examples of measures and targets in several areas. So for those who've participated in some of the previous workshops, you've seen more detailed discussions about the different types of methods that are used. I'll just provide a few high-level highlights of these general types of categories of methods we've seen across all of the performance areas. First, we see policy-based measures. These are generally designed to align targets with an agency's vision or broader, longer-term goals. So as an example, California initially set some of its fatality performance targets for 2019 based on an annual decrease of 3%. And that was consistent with its strategic highway safety plan goals of reducing fatalities. Other areas have kind of used a policy-based approach to consider how we can adjust off the trend or adjust off of a baseline figure to move towards a desired direction. We've also seen a number of states and regions use historical trends. And this is a simple data-driven approach using a historical trend line to forecast future performance as a basis for setting a target. During the first round of federally required target setting, this was a common approach for safety measures, non-SOV mode share, and annual hours of peak hour excessive delay per capita in particular. Often trend line analysis is fairly straightforward using simple analysis tools. And agencies may also use statistical tools to explore different ways to fit a trend beyond a simple linear trend line. Agencies can also make adjustments to those trends to reflect other factors. And we've seen some agencies look at trends, particularly pre and post-COVID, for some of the issues like traffic congestion and reliability, and do some analysis of where is the trend heading, or is the trend moving back towards a historical level. A third area is probabilistic and risk-based approaches, and these approaches involve statistical analysis to explore likely variations in performance levels. and often involves estimating a range of potential future performance based on an observed variance in the performance levels in the past. So it's essentially looking at confidence intervals and how confident are we that performance will fall within a certain range, and then a target can be selected based on that range. A related approach we've seen, particular for the reliability, the travel time reliability and freight reliability measures, is to look at the risk that a segment of roadway will shift from reliable to unreliable or vice versa. And this is important for that particular performance measure because while there's a lot that goes into the calculation, it's a simple reliable or non-reliable for each segment of roadway. And so looking at the possibilities of moving from one to the other could have an overall impact on the percentage, on the overall level of reliability. So, so that's a useful approach, particularly for a measure like that. We also have a number of different performance areas have the opportunity to use statistical models that are multivariable in nature, that account for many different explanatory factors. So this goes beyond a historical trend line, which uses a simple statistical analysis or trend, but this would account for many different factors that affect performance. And these approaches typically involve collecting data on the different factors that influence performance to develop a regression equation or statistical equation to best fit the data. One of the issues here is that you have an equation or formula for calculating future performance. You also need to develop forecasts of the individual variables that are part of your formula in developing in order to forecast the future performance. And finally, a last area of method that we see is generally other methods and tools that include different types of systems and forecasting models. So for infrastructure measures, we often see use of pavement management systems that encompass detailed data on pavement conditions, along with algorithms that account for deterioration rates and performance prediction as part of life cycle planning analysis. For congestion measures, including the non-SOV mode share and peak hour excessive delay, some regions have applied regional travel demand forecasting models to assess traffic levels and mode shares and use that as part of their analysis for setting their targets. So that's a broad overview of the range of methods we've seen, and we'll talk further about really what's a useful way to select a method and what are some of the lessons learned from the different methods that have been applied across these various performance areas. I'll just note that the guidebook, beyond talking about these individual measures, has a menu of different fact sheets included for each of the identified methods for each performance area. And so for each one, it talks about what the method is, when it can be used, what data and other resources are needed, including tools, as well as some steps for implementation, advantages, limitations, and examples of how those methods have been applied. The guidebook also has information, as I noted, about non-required measures. This is not as detailed in terms of discussing methods for target setting, since many areas have not actually set targets for these measures, although some have. This section of the guide talks more about reasons that these types of performance measures might be used, why targets might be set for them, and gives examples in 5 different areas, focusing on accessibility measures, greenhouse gas emissions measures, active transportation types of measures around bicycle, pedestrian, either activity or access and connectivity, as well as transit ridership, and then also customer satisfaction measures, which have been used by some state DOTs. So our focus today really will be taking all this information we have on all these different methods and really exploring, well, what makes a target setting method effective? And as part of this study, we identified 4 kind of primary characteristics of methods that may contribute to effectiveness. These came out of pilot testing with some of the states, as well as dialogues we've had through different focus groups and discussions with state DOTs and MPOs about their target setting processes. And we see issues like ease of application. States and regions want to have methods that are, not very time and technically intensive in terms of resources that are needed. And being able to devote, having relatively simple methods has been seen as something appreciated and desired. At the same time, technical robustness is a key issue. And there's often an interest and desire to have methods that account for many different factors that affect performance in order to be able to really understand and better predict what that performance will look like and why performance is changing. We also see interest in having ease of communication. Some methods are easier to communicate themselves, and they also may result in targets that are easier to understand because the targets conform to the desired direction of an outcome, which it can be more difficult to explain if the target is not in the desired direction that we would like to see for that performance area. And then finally, allowing for policy consideration. Essentially, policy can be incorporated into any method that's used, but issues like moving towards zero deaths is an important issue that came through in a lot of discussion about safety. And how do either the methods we use or the ultimate way we select the target, how does it help to support the policies that we have as either a state or region? Ultimately, these 4 different characteristics have some commonalities, but also some conflicts at times between them, as you can see, between ease of application and the technical complexities. But ultimately, what we see as making targets effective, or the methods effective, is that the methods help to inform investments and strategies by providing some information that helps to inform the factors that are driving performance, and helps to motivate stakeholders and decision makers to engage in discussions about actions to take. So that ultimately it's not just about setting a target, but it's about understanding how we're going to improve performance overall. With that as a background, I'm going to then have, I think what many of you may be most interested in is hearing from our 2 speakers from 2 different states to talk about the lessons they've experienced broadly in setting targets across the performance areas and their considerations associated with selecting target setting methods. So we'll start with Deanna Belden from Minnesota DOT. And then after her presentation, we'll have a little time for questions and then go on to Edgardo Block from Connecticut DOT. So with that, I think you can bring up Deanna's presentation and then I'll turn it over to Deanna.
Thanks. I can still only see you, Michael, so I'll assume, though, that folks can see me, and I will go ahead and start.
Yes.
Okay. So thank you. I'm going to go over MnDOT's experience and what we've learned with federal measure targets. Oops. The host muted me, is that correct?
Sorry, I made a mistake.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Okay, I think so. I'm going to give some background, brief context on each of the measures I find easiest to go through the list, and we'll highlight some of the methods we used and the lessons learned. So next slide, please. So by 2019, after our first submission to for the federal measures for PM2 and PM3, that was due in October of 2018, we realized that we had to have a 1-pager to try to explain the difference between state measures, our Minnesota state DOT measures, and federal measures and targets. Because we've been doing performance measurement for a long time, and the addition of the federal measures was frankly confusing for us, for our stakeholders, for our legislators. So we developed this 1-pager, and it did help some. It takes you through the purpose and how we develop measures in our state, and most importantly for this discussion, about targets. So our targets are typically developed through our publicly vetted long-range planning process, and a Minnesota target describes a desired outcome or what we want to happen. And for the most part, there's no deadline to meet the target. It's a goal we continually work to achieve. So this is in contrast to the federal targets that we better describe then as expected outcomes, or what we think will happen in the 1, 2, or 4 year timeframe of how they're required. So now, of course, since then, some or many states have set more aspirational federal targets, specifically mostly for safety. But the original intent, as we understood, of the federal targets were to be an expected or a predicted outcome. So we needed to help clarify, since both use the word targets. And I admit, I said maybe we should go back to our state plan and not call our targets, but the problem was things like goal. We already have goal meaning, a slightly different thing. So we've stuck with that word, and we're muddling through. Okay, next slide, please. So now to fatalities. We saw nice declines in fatalities over the last couple of decades. And so when we first started reporting the federal measures, we established targets that weren't aspirational just yet, but with assumptions such as no substantial changes to modifications to policies or laws, no substantial changes to the investments or the funding allocated to safety measures, and we were projecting a modest increase in BMT, for example. So we were able to have our federal targets be more, calculated that way, but also still projecting improvements. But then we adopted our Strategic Highway Safety Plan 2020 to 2024 with a bold policy target of 225 fatalities by 2025. So this graphic here shows how we were planning to march downward toward that goal. And so this is similar to what Michael just mentioned about California decreasing a certain amount per year toward their zero goal. So we also did participate in the pilot for safety target setting, but we didn't choose to use that type of method for prediction because we were focusing on this goal from our SHSP. And we do think this allows for ease of communication and policy consideration, and frankly for safety, reducing fatalities is really just the only thing we find to be acceptable. Next slide, please. So, okay, so we had that nice decline in past years, and but then we got in our fatality numbers for 2020 and 2021 did not come in as hoped. I think most states saw increases in the pandemic, people out, cooped up and driving crazy fast, and a lot more fatalities, even though lower VMT. So we still do want to reach 225 by 2025, but we have the challenge that much larger declines would be needed every year to get there. So for this target setting, we have these scenarios there in the table. We have recommended to keep our target the same as 2023, and that would be keeping it flat, but we just cannot stomach any increase. So some challenges with this, included our coordination with Department of Public Safety, who's submitting the targets, their measure targets to NHTSA, and the 3 that need to be identical. And that was challenging because we really are doing more policy-based, and their direction from NHTSA really wants to be more numeric. And so we came back, and at one point they said, it's not numerically possible for us to meet the target that we're proposing, given the number of fatalities that had happened already. And okay, they might be right, but we still don't like that. And then we have a conflict coming up with the IIJA starting in 2024. The NHTSA measures and targets are going to be required to be improving, and that's not, and while that's actually what MnDOT would prefer, is improving targets, that for others that is in conflict with the direction from Federal Highway. So they're hoping, there is a group getting together hoping to try to resolve those. For safety, now what we've heard is the best part is not necessarily what we set for the targets, but the conversations every year about safety. And so that has been a good thing. Every year they're going, our safety folks along with me are going in front of our senior leaders and having a really nice discussion about what's going on with safety. Next slide, please. So for pavement measures, this chart looks at, we look at trends and then interpolate to the federal measures, because we have a very robust pavement model, but it can't predict the federal measures. So we look at the relationship between the two and make an estimate for the federally required 2- and 4-year targets. So we don't have plans to change our pavement model, as we feel like it has been working for us to manage our system. So it's been okay to try to do this. You can see on the upper left, the trend seems to follow the burnt orange color was our actual federal pavement data, and as opposed to our state, and it followed nicely. So we figured we could estimate a % good target. But one of them in the lower right for % poor in 2021, the % poor for the federal measure went above the state values, and that had not happened in the time we had been tracking these two. So unclear, we felt good about the relationship made between the two, not so sure now. But we did, for that % poor, we actually used our state target of 2% for our federal 2- and 4-year targets, because it just was kind of close enough. Didn't want to parse out to say it should be 1% for the 2- and 4-year targets. So we kind of vary depending on the measure what we want to do. Next slide, please. So the current MnDOT bridge measure and the federal measures are nearly the same. So what we use, I show the two together with the orange and green bars to show that they're very close. So this seems that using our Minnesota bridge forecast should be adequate to project the condition. And it's pretty technically robust. I don't quite call it a bridge model because they've told me it's not quite the same as a pavement model, but they are bridge forecasts using the projects that are programmed to be built. So one of the problems we had with this measure and this method was we had a big drop in the % good, and we ended up not meeting our target for the federal measures. But this was due to, we had an increased accuracy of bridge inspection data over the past handful of years because of rigorous training, review, and quality control of bridge inspections. And so really, it wasn't that the inventory was different, but that we had a more realistic and accurate picture of the inventory. So we changed our target, and that was not really very alarming. Our federal highway partner supported a 35% good target. But then we got our data in, and the slide taking care of that was not finished. And so we again didn't meet our 4-year target. Now, we are perfectly happy and prepared to do the additional reporting required by federal highway. That'll be a description of actions we're taking to achieve the target. I mean, and really funny part is one of the actions we did was to try to make the target a more accurate reflection of the 2- and 4-year conditions. But we'll be submitting that in October with our 2022 submission. And we found that scarier than missing that target was actually the letter that came from FHWA, because I believe that I bring these to our senior leaders and we talk about how we're going to just miss that target. And I guess I probably didn't emphasize it enough, because when the letter came in, there was alarm. And I said, no, we did know that. We knew that was going to happen. What we have to do is do this additional reporting. It's okay. But that was, the letter was worse than, it was tough. So then a little bit more on bridge. Again, why a model or prediction might not be quite perfect is because we did have, the model didn't quite predict what we expected. We have one of our very large bridges bouncing in between fair and poor. So it bounced up when we didn't expect it might. And so then we missed that target for our % poor as well. And now we do like to say these projections don't include any of the potential grants from IIJA. Those are not reflected in the current forecast, just like to give that disclaimer. But in any case, we have a couple of really big bridges that then can swing the % poor, above or below our expected outcome or our target. Next slide. So here I'm showing the interstate NHS travel time reliability. For this one, we did set targets based on historic trend, not counting the pandemic years. So looking at the early evidence, we weren't quite sure when things might revert back to the pre-pandemic levels. And we had a nice discussion in our MnDOT work group looking at this, whether we should use the pre-pandemic as a baseline or include some of it. And we also noted that our greater Minnesota MPOs are returning to pre-pandemic conditions faster than our largest metro area. And given that we have the chance to adjust these targets at the midpoint, we set them how we did. But this one was looking at the historic trend. And I do note that our draft statewide multimodal plan is proposing a combined reliability measure, interstate and non-interstate NHS. And I like to say that, so because this is one of the federal measures we welcome because it gave us this nice NPM RDS data that we find to be useful. So we're using it. Next slide, please. So we did participate in the pilot for reliability. And so here's a graphic of the segment risk analysis we produced. It uses historical data on a segment to try to establish a performance trend with some level of uncertainty that can be used to estimate the likelihood of shifting from reliable to unreliable. So the challenge that we found with this is that major events like the COVID pandemic can disrupt previous performance trends, making most of the prior year's data nearly obsolete. So, and we'd also like a method that would be able to tell us something about the impact of individual projects. So we didn't end up finding this useful for this year for our federal target setting, but we are very glad we participated and explored the method. Next slide. So truck travel time reliability, I'm including this one for completeness just because I have all the other ones. This one again set on historic trends, but we are making our 2 and 4 year targets a little bit better than what we thought it might be in the long term at 1.4, but also noting that we are proposing this measure in our draft statewide multimodal plan of truck travel time reliability index of less than or equal to 1.5 as a long-term policy target. Next slide. So for non-SOV, our performance here had been improving in the Minneapolis-St. Paul metro area prior to the pandemic. When you see though, the big jump in the 2020 data includes 1 year of pandemic data. And so upcoming years will include more. And we are proposing, I guess it's probably hard to see, but proposing improvement at 28 and 29%. We want to see what else comes in, but we for this one, we really do want an improving trend too. So that's how we set that one. So I call it historic trends with a bit of aspiration thrown in. Next slide. So peak hour excessive delay was pretty interesting. So you see this enormous improvement in the 2 pandemic years. So, but for this measure, there's concern that if we set an expected outcome type target for the next 2 and 4 years, it would become a long-term policy target, even though that's not the intent of federal targets. So our thing is that from a policy perspective, we don't want to start saying that there's a lower threshold for congestion than we can tolerate that could be interpreted as a need for expansion. So frankly, for this one, if it weren't required, we would not be likely to use it. And it's also expected to expire for us if we stay an attainment area. But in any case, we then are proposing more of a historic trend type target of 8.5. And partly why we aren't as interested in this one is we really would like to focus now on moving toward other mobility measures like reliability and accessibility, rather than an excessive delay measure. Next slide. So here are some lessons learned. I hope I wove some in throughout the presentation, but I'd like to highlight, we think policy-based targets are really well suited for areas like safety with an aspirational long-term goals. We're very comfortable with that approach here. And again, the best part about the process being conversations that happen during the discussion, and for safety that happens when discussing the annual federal targets. But we have those discussions for our infrastructure measures as well when we have annual check-ins for our capital highway investment plan. So good conversations are happening around performance every year. And I would say if you have asset management models, use them. though really it seems they might be better suited for long-term projections, at least for our example with bridge was a case with that. And because we really want to see what's happening in the long term, whether any large bridge bounces between fair and poor wouldn't be as important as the long-term plan, because there's a plan to rehabilitate that bridge in the not so distant future, but it makes us miss our federal targets. So anyway, that's a trade-off there. And then also the trend-based target setting really may be as good as some of the statistical models in the short term. And so we just found it easier and just as good to use those in this short-term target setting. But I'm really interested in the work that's being done and the research that's being done to understand these explanatory factors, because again, in the long term, if we want to affect some of these measures, we need to know what the levers are that can affect them. And so I'm definitely interested to follow that research and dig in some more and see what we can learn from that. And I think that's it. Thank you.
Great, thanks so much, Deanna. We have a little bit of time if anyone has any questions specific for Deanna's presentation. So you can feel free to put questions in the chat pod. Also feel free to raise your hand and you can do that. I believe, actually, Sarah, you can remind me, there's a little area in the bottom where you can raise your hand if you want to ask a question there.
Yep, if you click the raise hand button at the bottom of the screen, then we'll see that your hand is raised and we'll let you unmute.
Well, as we're thinking about that, I think this provided really great food for thought about across all of these different measures, how you've approached in different ways the setting of targets and utilized a range of different approaches to assessing them. I think maybe I don't see any questions popping up right now, so maybe we can just move on to Edgardo's presentation, and then we have some time for questions at the end, as well as some discussion questions that we want to pose to everyone here. So thank you, Deanna, again. And again, feel free throughout any of the presentations to add to the chat questions if you like. So I think next we'll bring in the presentation for Edgardo Block from Connecticut DOT, and he'll talk about some of the experiences they've had.
Michael, I'm actually seeing a couple of hands raised.
Oh, yes. Okay. Why don't we do that first for a minute before Edgardo? So Deanna, don't leave. We do have a few questions, it looks like, for you. So the first one I see is Caroline Dickey. Is she unmuted now?
Oh, can you hear me? Sorry.
Yes. Yes.
Okay, great. So first, I just wanted to point out, I don't know if this is true for everyone, but it looks to me like the chat is disabled.
Oh.
So that might be one thing there.
Okay,
And
well,
I don't know if
thank
that's
you
just a user error on my part, but and then I did have a question about the bridge target setting. So with that, oh yeah, I see the chat's working now. So great, that's awesome. So with that, what sort of recommendation would you make? What would you have done differently, I guess, with that process?
I think I would have given us a little bit more wiggle room if we're setting the short-term 2 and 4 year targets. That's probably what I would do. I mean, and it's a difficult balance and needle to thread, because we don't want to, say we're happy with, too much of a percent, or I mean, we don't want to make too low a percent good. Like, we don't want to say we're happy with 25 or 30% good, or 20 or 25 if we think we're going to be at 35. But in this case, it seems that we probably could have used a bit of more wiggle room because our model wasn't perfect. And so that's what I'd say with that one.
Absolutely, thank you. Yeah, that is a hard decision to make.
Okay, great. I see Jack Chan also has his hand raised. So if Sarah, you can unmute him. And also when you ask your question, if you could just identify what organization you're with, that's helpful to us as well. So are we able to unmute Jack?
Jack should now be able to unmute himself. So hopefully that will work.
Okay. Yes, Jack, are you there? It looks like you're unmuted. Well, I'm not hearing you.
Sorry, I think I have the wrong press upon button.
Oh, go ahead. We can hear you now. Oh, do you have a question?
Maybe we can get the question in the chat for.
Yeah, we could have the question in the chat if you're having technical difficulty. As we're waiting, or if you want to try to come back on, I do see Vicki Miller, it looks like, has a question, has her hand raised as well. So if you could be unmuted, then you can ask your question as well. Oops.
It looks like she lowered her hand.
Oh, she lowered her hand. Okay, maybe that. Okay, well, if
well, it looks like we had a question in the chat.
Okay.
FHWA representative Raghu. Deanna, I think you saw that. Thoughts on modifying the safety?
Yeah, I am not sure. I mean, I know that serious injuries are also horrible, and yet we seem to have a Towards Zero Death coalition with other agencies, and so I guess I'm not sure. Can you tell me your thoughts of why that would be better? Because I hadn't thought of combining. It feels sometimes like when we're combining, we lose something. Like we have the combined non-motorized, and yet we still are interested in the difference between pedestrians and bicycles. So within our agency, we would still look at those separately, but maybe for federal reporting, it's okay to combine. Okay. Now, but that is interesting too, because I think we capture that. I mean, if they do end up passing away, we capture that as a fatality. But yeah, I guess I don't have really prepared thoughts on that because I hadn't thought of that.
Or perhaps the thought that I'm having looking at that is that the types of crashes that result in serious injuries or fatalities could be, the same. It could be the same crashes that are happening that are resulting in each, and it's minor differences as to whether it ends up being a fatality or not. And so I guess one question is it possible to get to zero deaths without also reducing the serious injury crashes? And I'd be interested to hear from some safety experts on that.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not a safety expert, but during the pandemic, when our volumes dropped by 50%, the fatalities didn't, but the serious injuries did track VMT down. So that's a hint that it's probably merits combine with caution, because that's a very interesting informational point, that there may be a subset of drivers or a certain behavior that is or a combination of factors that is driving a difference with the outcomes. So I think it's definitely something that we need to talk about, and I'm not a safety expert either, but that's one thing that stuck out from the data early in the pandemic.
And then thinking about it more now that we're chatting about it, I know that using evidence-based treatments, like Minnesota went ahead and did rumble stripes all over on the rural roadways, since the 2-lane rural roadways are the most unsafe. And so that's a treatment that would hopefully help fatalities and serious injuries because of the head-on crashes. So I'm not clear yet whether the combining the metric would assist, but it might. But it seems to me to focus on the treatments to prevent the most serious type of crashes.
Okay, well, thanks for your question. That's an interesting dialogue here. Why don't we move on to Edgardo for your presentation, and then we'll have some more time to talk about effectiveness and different approaches to target setting. So why don't you go ahead and take it away?
Okay, good afternoon, everybody, or good morning or good evening, or wherever you are logging in from. So thank you so much for attending, and I'm glad that we got to see Michael Grant's presentation and Deanna's, because some of what I'm going to be talking about is in parallel. And in fact, there's a little graphic on a framework that is not the exact classification that 2307 has. And so I'm not trying to advocate for using the one that we did. It's just the tool that we used at Connecticut DOT. Next. So, and I also use custom animation. So I'm going to just read and hope that, yeah. So the first thing, the overarching theme is that TPM at the highest level is about our actions and the outcomes that we get, whether it's return on investment, establishing line of sight. And that has a big impact on which target methodology you can set. Next. And then I'm going to show our framework for assessing our ability to forecast outcomes and set targets. And then considerations, kind of playing this out. What do you need to think about when you're selecting a target setting method? And then two applications, one in pavement and system reliability, and how we chose what we chose for target setting. And lastly, one slide on a forward look at target setting, and I think it hits on some of the themes that we saw. Okay, so if you go to the Federal Highways TPM site, it's a very neat and beautiful diagram that I use often. So, and this is about actions and outcomes. You decide to invest a certain way, and then you execute, and then people raise their hands in happiness because you did so well delivering on that. And if you think actions impacting outcomes, and we can move to the next slide and then the other one, a very idealized case, you have a light switch that's off, and then you decide to flick it. That's the action, and the outcome is that the circuit is closed and the light bulb lights up. But in reality, the next slide shows that when we look at something like system performance, it reminds me more of this than a light switch. You have something like system reliability, and then you try to impact it one way or another, and then you're measuring different metrics, and they don't quite tell you that it's not so clear that the light is on. Okay. So when we looked at the final rule, the measures that would become effective in 2018, we sat down area by area and tried to classify them by this approach, which is, it sort of tracks what 2307 is doing. I probably will replace this with 2307s, but it's our way of understanding how to set targets. So the aspirational ones track the policy-based, or things that are not data intensive, but that there's just something that you want to reach, but you don't do anything, you don't measure the impact of what you're doing to achieve that particular target. Extrapolation, which is basically the historical approach. The forecasting model, which is pretty much the same. And then the systems approach, which is called other, but I think it's an inside look into systems. If you can explain the mechanics of your actions and tie them, if you know that you're lighting on a switch, you're conducting a paving project, and you get this result, then you get a direct cause and effect relationship. And so you have a much bigger explanatory power, and with some ability to understand and in particular play scenarios out better. So that we found very useful, and we used it for when we got approval through our executive team to kind of frame all of our target setting decisions in terms of the methodology used and why one area used one and one the other. So this and the higher level, I will say 2307 set of classifications of techniques is very useful in terms of target setting that is effective. And I think you need to match a few things to your situation so that you can use this properly. We can move on to the next one. So the considerations, again, going back to the actions and outcomes frame. So from the outcomes end, one of them is how well does a measure capture the performance goal? So we have these national performance goals, and how well it captures it could be an issue with the time frame. So in the case of bridges, you design a bridge and it could be a 75-year design. The performance period is 4 years. In terms of scope, is do you have do you impact the entirety of the scope of the measures? Okay, go ahead. And correlated to that, the jurisdictional control over the actions that you can take to impact the performance. So that impacts the kind of target setting that you can do. Next. And then what is the alignment between your states? We heard from Deanna. I'm glad, so I can move. What's the alignment between what you're trying to do and what the national measures are trying to do? Okay. So here's the scope explained in terms of roads. This is, applies to many measures. So the safety measures apply to all roads. And then infrastructure measures and system reliability apply to interstates. But we, as a state agency, you can hit the next slide. We impact the state highway system, which overlaps the NHS, contains the interstates, but leaves out a lot of the other roads. And sometimes we influence what gets done through the stewardship role that we have with money that's provided by FHWA. So this has a big impact. If you don't control a lot of what you're forecasting, then doing a systems approach is difficult. Go ahead. Here's just a table listing the scope of the different things. Congestion is, different targets for urbanized areas greater than 200,000 population. And that's different from anything that we showed you on roads. Go ahead. One thing that we do in terms of alignment is just we have a dashboard, very much like the one-pagers that Deanna mentioned. We have a dashboard with each measure and the corresponding national measure. I purposely put in a case where for project delivery, there is no national measure yet anyway. So, but we have one at the state. So here's our narrative and says, why is it important to us and what the difference might be so that people have an easy one-stop shop to go to understand why things may be different one and another. In terms of actions, so you can hit, yeah. The key question is here, like, what can I do? So am I structured the right way to take this on and develop a program and take actions that turn on the switch and impact performance? So is there an asset management program in an organization that has it explicitly listed? And that is true in our case for payment and bridge, not so much true for, there are programs in areas, but for congestion, system reliability, and freight movement, it's a lot fuzzier as to whether we can deliver a program. Is there a performance-based planning process? Minnesota's is an example, it's a great example of plan alignment to the long-range plan. They've been doing this for a while and very well. And then are there programs for delivering projects in each performance area? Are there pavement projects, signal projects, or reliability projects more specifically? Okay. And lastly, what is your ability to deliver and what you say you might? So you can throw money at it, but are you sized up to deliver the same thing? So if you don't have enough contractors, or if your program is really large, you may just end up paying more for the same by investing more money if you exceed the capacity. And then can you measure the impacts of the projects on performance? From the risk standpoint, that using a likelihood and impact kind of framework, there are 3 questions that I could see easily that you need to worry about in terms of putting a lot of effort into target setting one way versus another. One is, what's the probability of executing the actions that lead to certain targets or outcomes? And then if you have a high probability, what's the probability of those actions delivering the expected performance? So did you construct well? And lastly, what happens if you do not set performance? So there are two kinds of impacts. One is the impact on actual performance, and the second is the impact of not meeting the targets. And we just heard from Deanna, we had the same kind of we did a week of grief prior to the meeting with the division administrator and our commissioner, because the letter is worded in a certain way that's just very blunt, saying you didn't make progress. And so that is a consequence that we don't want to incur. Okay. So I'll give you a quick example on infrastructure. For pavement condition, we're pretty well aligned from the outcome end. Like, we like the pavement metrics. They capture condition rather well, although we could argue about details and things. They can be predicted at the metric level anyway, in methods that are not very hard to understand. We have jurisdiction over most of the applicable highways, the NHS, and we have a reasonable alignment between state and national goals. So we want to maximize condition over the long term in the same way. In the actions, we have pavement and asset management units, and there are programs. There's a preservation program, a rehab program, a resurfacing program that can deliver the actions and produce the outcome. So we have pretty good line of sight. Okay. From the risks, we have a track record of tracking this over a period of time. So we kind of know that if we say we're going to do something and we have the funding for it, it will deliver a certain result. So in this case, what we chose was the systems approach. Use our pavement management system. You can move on to the next, and I'll explain how quickly how we did that. We did some webinars on initial target setting a few years ago. So we use the pavement management system. We make investments the way that we invest, meaning at the project scale. Next, we account for planned intervention. So this is very important in a very short time frames versus the long-term performance. A lot of the performance determination is whether you did the project or not. And then the big work was expressing the performance in terms of the national performance metrics, which then allows you to calculate the measures. But the metrics is the way that they really relate. So, and then get the prediction at the right scale. So we found that the segments were too long, so it was kind of washing out the poor and the good. And we needed to have these projections represented at the 10th of a mile level. And then follow the TAP. That's how you execute the plan. So in this area, we felt pretty comfortable that we could do it this way. Now let's look at system reliability. Very different scenario in many ways. For us, it's a very new measure. We have a jurisdiction over the roads, but the things that drive performance, we don't have that much control over it to the same degree that we do with pavement projects. So we have economic trends that we don't control, demographics, land use policy, we definitely do not control. So there are many things that influence performance that you, no matter what you do, they are impacted by a different variable and a different driving force. And the alignment between state goals and national goals isn't as clear. It's just because it's new. Okay. From the actions, you know, our planning and engineering units focus on indirectly on system reliability through operational improvements and corridor studies. There is no dedicated program, dedicated to system reliability per se. So it's going to be some kind of indirect effect. But at the same time, we do have the NPM RDS. Deanna mentioned that too. It's a great set of data to allow the measurement of the impacts. From the risk perspective is we're not so sure we can execute on time because project delivery is based on individual program delivery timelines. And sometimes those hinge on other programs. These are appendages to other projects. And the predictive ability is limited, at Connecticut DOT anyway. And I think that's true for most of us because the data that's sort of constant that we can rely on comes from 2017 forward. So that's getting better. Okay. So here we decided to look at in that case, 1 year of data. And then what we've done is added more years as the performance period goes on. And what we want to move to is a forecasting model. So we don't think we can get to a systems approach because we cannot control the cause and effect relationship very well. But we can understand how these things how these things, what are the forces acting on these. So let's look at why we would want to move to a forecasting model. One of them is to kind of develop a program that's performance based, measure the impact of investments, and prioritize those investments by the ones that give you the best performance improvement. And we do have sufficient measurement to enable calibration and validation of models that we do produce. We don't have complete control over performance action, so that throws out the systems approach. But it does enable a performance-based program that is aligned with a long-range transportation plan for the agency. The next is, how do you do this? So we need an approach that allows for incremental improvement, and I don't have to go back to square one. So state DOTs vary in their capabilities, and the data availability also varies. So travel time reliability is easy. Volumes are a little harder, and other things, some economic trends are harder, and demographic trends are even harder. So state staffing resources also vary over time, and you cannot lose the effort of one. So you need to be able to take and improve in one area and then use that building block and then go to the next area and take it on like that. In this case, for system reliability, the things that are low-hanging fruit are account for weather. We have snow events. They greatly impact travel time. So that may have an impact if it hits the 80th percentile on some segments. We heard about the segment-based risk model, and weather is one where I can predict or use the probability-based forecasts to kind of set the targets. Work zones or specific projects, the data are available, so we can, if we have an accounting of what we're doing over the performance period, we can measure that impact. Non-recurring congestion, the data are there, but we need data mining techniques. And then accounting for planned projects. So that's kind of something that is a running theme. We need to know what we're doing over 4 years because it will have an outsized impact on performance. So break the trend into components incrementally and use appropriate techniques. And there's going to be a transition period where you're just picking off a little bit and you have this other trend that you can't quite explain, subject to all these other forces, and you're chipping away at it and getting to the real mechanics of the situation. We can move on. And my last slide is just a wish, but items 3 and 4, the predictive models and based on explanatory variables and the systems approach, I believe they allow you to do a reliability-based target setting process that's quantitative. So if you just do a single point forecasting for your trend, and it happens to be a normal distribution, and you hit the midpoint, the expected value is going to be a 50% probability of meeting it. So it depends on what your tolerance is for not meeting a target, whether you're okay sitting at 50th percentile reliability. And for some measures, it might be fine based on consequences and all that. But the forecasting models allow you to run simulation runs, whether it's Monte Carlo, scenario analysis, other things that take variability into account, and set a reliability-based target and start there. Like, I need to be 90% reliable or 95% reliable that our bridge targets are going to be met. Then from there, I can explain why I'm picking the target that I am, because I've captured the variability. And the last slide is just to bring it back to 2307, because I'm looking forward to the product of this research as a way to improve what we did over the last 4 years and make it more formal, and take it to the next level and move sustainably and build on the progress. You can click through the end because I think that's it. So, but the end all is to then enable me to tie my actions and see the impact on the outcomes. And that's kind of the overall perspective that we have taken, in that I see the 2307 leverages to be applicable in a much more broad way to most performance management, to generalized performance management. And that's all I have. Thank you for your cooperation, and apologies for having custom animation, which I will swear off for the remainder of my living days.
Well, thank you, Edgardo. We have a little bit of time for a few questions, if anyone has it for him about the approaches taken. I will just ask you, it was interesting that you have kind of prior to the work we did, you saw the same kinds of approaches in many ways, and had that kind of nice pyramid diagram. But in terms of developing those more complex methods or forecasting for like reliability, have you been able to identify the different factors that are influencing reliability, and how are you doing that if you are?
No, what we're doing is one of the last slides is we're going to start with the projects and the weather first, and then peel that off of the blob of variability that I cannot explain right now. That's just one number that I'm looking through time. So once I've parceled that off and I can explain what those do, and they have a big impact over the short performance periods that we're looking for with federal highways. So I will say that even with pavement, my strategy of preserving pavements or rehabbing them doesn't have that much of an impact as far as how many projects do I get done in 4 years, because that's a big switch from the poor or fair to a good condition immediately, and that outweighs the probabilistic. You know, when you put all the projects in the aggregate, Deanna mentioned the bridge that was wobbling between fair and poor. When you put all the pavement stuff together, that kind of washes out. But those investments you make in the beginning make you have a big jump. So for the 4-year period, you know, accounting for everything is important. But to manage the asset or to manage the performance, you need to look at the appropriate time period. I think we're just getting started. I see, because of the measurement tool is there, because we have other tools we haven't brought to bear, like the travel demand model and other variables, that it is possible to get to a forecasting model in system reliability. Just the actual measure may not be easy to forecast because it's either reliable or unreliable. So it's a zero binary outcome. Mm-hmm. But there must be a metric, either was the LOTTR or some of the underlying metrics, that is where you really do the forecasting.
Okay, great. And I do see a comment came into the chat pod that the CAT lab at the University of Maryland released some research classifying delay on the NHS according to its cause, and the effects on reliability should be roughly proportional to those different causes. And they list weather, incidents, construction, etc.
Yeah, you know, that proportional part, I just need to look at it more. So there are some segments where it can impact reliability, and there are some that are, you know, there's no congestion ever. There's no delay. You can have twice as many storms as you do in a particular year, and it'll still be reliable. But I think you mentioned segment-based risk. What's the risk of being? It's a probability of throwing either a 0 or a 1 with a two-sided, you know, a coin, flipping reliable and unreliable. So that 0 1 to me is not what you forecast. It's the probability. That's where you do your forecasting. That's my quick take on that.
Okay, great. And we did have some dialogue in the webinar or the web-based workshop focused on reliability and congestion measures that that did touch on some of the kinds of approaches some areas are looking at to try to forecast or model that. One of the challenges is, I think, then you have to forecast, well, what will weather look like in the future? I mean, you might be able to forecast how much construction because you have plans. Some of these things might be harder to forecast as well.
Yeah, I will say one thing about that particular, the weather. So if you start, that's why I put the last slide on reliability-based forecasting, because if you decide that up front, I'm designing a reliability based on you know, I need a 90% reliability. That tells me what kind of climate data to use, not actual climate data, but probabilistic. How many storms is a 95th percentile winter or whatever, and then use that and do data imputation and other techniques to kind of see what the impact of that would be on reliability. So you can that's how I would do that.
Okay. Are there other comments? I see a few in the chat as well. And there's Edgardo, did you see those as well?
I'm looking, there's something on for Edgardo, I see. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
You know,
Yep.
the comment is
Yeah.
just about, you know, you might.
That's a
be
great comment by Alan.
Impact on one measure, but it'll have a completely different
Yes.
impact on another.
I mean, we're going to hit that with the greenhouse measure right away, that any activity tends to require energy, which tends to increase emissions if you're not completely net zero. I see Michael Yakono's great comment. Yes, and Raghu Kaushik, I hope I pronounced that right, said, how about incident management programs? Yes, I want to know whether I should invest in an incident management program or capacity improvement or whatever it is. That's exactly the point of why a forecasting model that has some explanatory power is preferable to just the historical trends. I wouldn't know that without looking at the data and trying to explain what is driving the reliability. That's exactly the point of investing that extra effort.
So Edgardo, do you currently include incident management programs as part of your kind of, you're willing to be including it in the kind of projects?
In the next performance cycle, we're, you know, now we've just, like, as of last week, we found out I have available a listing of all the incidents. And I just see from Michael Yakono that CatLab has also the ability to record that. And I think that's super important because it will give me a chance to analyze the data and see what the impact is of those things, and then see whether I should prioritize them and all that. But that's the plan.
I think we look forward next year to hearing about how it goes.
Well, I hope to be smiling like this.
Good. Well, thank you so much for your presentation, and thank you to Deanna as well as providing some, you know, real world perspectives from 2 different states about your experience. I'm going to bring back, just to actually bring this back to the overall group here, and try to share a little bit more experience. We noted earlier some of the different considerations in selecting a target setting method and balancing ease of application, robustness, ease of communication, policy considerations, but ultimately having methods that hopefully help to inform investment decisions and motivate stakeholders to have the discussions needed to really focus on improving performance. We have a couple polling questions here to kind of ask and get your input on which of these factors you find most important in your own organizations. So I think actually, Sarah, do you want to just explain? I think you're able to bring up the poll question here and people can select how important is, like, for instance, ease of application and selecting a method. Actually, it looks like you can see all of these 4 factors together at once. It looks like, and answer each of these.
Yes, so yeah, just let me know when to stop and I'll share the poll with everyone, the results.
Okay, so it asks basically for each of these 4 areas: ease of application, technical robustness, ease of communication, and allowing policy consideration. What do you value most in selecting target setting methods? And you know, there are sometimes trade-offs. Some things are more important, or you may need to consider, you know, we'll select a method that maybe is simpler for certain reasons, or maybe we want the more complex modeled approach. So take a few minutes, or not a few minutes, but maybe a few more seconds here to go through each of these and let us know if you think, you know, each of these is very important somewhat, or not very important when you're looking to select a method for target setting. Okay, and I'm seeing, looks like a few more people are still answering the poll, but most, it seems like it's slowing down. So, okay, we'll just give a few more seconds, and then Sarah, you could share the poll results here.
Perfect. So now you should be able to see the results, but let me know if it's not coming up.
It's hard for me to tell. Can others see the poll results?
Jody says yes.
Okay, that sounds good. So I guess looking at this, what do we see? I mean, I think it looks like, a lot of these are considered important or very important. I do see the ease of communication seem to hit on, and the ease of application, particularly, there are more people saying that's very important to them in selecting a method. But all of these are clearly considerations. I don't know, Anna, do you have any other observations from this or?
No, the only other one being that technical robustness had the most somewhat importance or not importance, I would say, which is interesting.
Yes, that is an interesting result, and I would be curious to hear, and maybe that comes back to just having a policy-based target and saying we want to move in this direction.
Mm-hmm.
So, okay, Sarah, do I need to stop sharing that, or you'll can move that off there? And then here, what we wanted to do is just, we sort of got at this a little bit in the poll at what factors you value most when selecting a target setting method and these trade-offs, but wanted to open it up to others on the line. If you have thoughts based on this discussion from the two presentations, as well as just your own experience about what you value most and why you think it's important either to have a more robust technical method or prefer to have simple methods. Is there anyone who would like to just add a little bit to this or share some of your experience as well in setting targets across different performance areas?
Looks like Margie already has a comment about the exercise of target setting has been positive, but it's a big level of effort. And these are not necessarily driving funding decisions. And so are folks considering this in how you approach it?
That's a good point. I wonder if others have thoughts on that. I mean, the level of effort can be significant for setting targets if you're doing especially a more robust technical forecasting approach. Mm-hmm. Have folks consider? I see Edgardo, did you want to respond?
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of the idea of looking at the scope, from how well the actions tie to outcomes. So if you have a direct link to what you do and the performance is one of the considerations, and how important it is in terms of the plan is another. They all have to be in place for you to spend a lot of effort, is the point. You can prioritize. If you're not ready to do it, then you can get going, but you should prioritize the ones that are really tied to what Margie says is your funding decisions. They really govern.
I think that's ultimately the desire, to use the target setting process, as you said, not just to set a number, but to help inform factors or help inform funding, hopefully. Deanna, did you want to comment on that as well?
Well, mostly for our pavement and bridge, I mean, we have found that we can describe that we're setting our federal targets based on projects that are already programmed, just 6 or so years out. And so the funding decisions have happened already. And so we're more, reporting than our expected outcome for pavement and bridge anyway. So there is kind of a timing mismatch, but we are still using performance to work toward decisions.
We also just wanted to ask, has the process of setting targets itself helped the agency beyond just the need to meet a federal requirement, but to help understand factors affecting performance or discussions that help to support maybe funding decisions or different types of actions? I think, Deanna, you touched a little bit on that, but curious both your perspectives or from anyone here, has anyone found success in really making the target setting process valuable in terms of then making different decisions? Or Deanna?
Well, it looks like Felix has a really good point, is that if we already had performance targets, then it becomes more of an exercise. But to try to, that's why looking at the positive part of it is that we are having more robust conversations about safety. And then we are able to expand our portfolio of measures with the reliability data that's being provided through the NPM RDS.
Great. Okay, well, this certainly there's lots to think about here, and folks can certainly feel free to add other things into the chat.
Well, there's another comment about Bill having a major effect, and I'm curious, other folks in there, if you could, raise your hand or put it in the chat. Are you expecting the funding and the new programs through Bill to have effect on this performance period, or has that already been washed out from cost increases and other capacity issues, as Edgardo alluded to before?
It's a good point. There is a lot more funding coming, out, so it should create opportunities to really look at performance here.
Yeah, and I noted that those aren't in our projections yet because we don't have the way we're doing them is based on the projects that are programmed, at least talking about pavement and bridge. So we haven't guessed at what that would be until we would get them into the model.
So Felix and Lou, sorry, go ahead. Do you have something else?
No, I mean, I think what Deanna mentioned about the obligation being a little bit ahead of the performance period, I think, but the one thing that, and also the trends in inflation, price inflation and all that are eating away at the impact of Bill. That's my sense. The other feature that will have an impact is the length of time that bill is authorizing. So it will allow financing of bigger projects. So we could see a bigger impact down the road as we can plan out further in our capital plans a little bit with funding that way.
That's a good point.
I'm going to move on to actually have Anna, then you talk a little bit further beyond the methods used. The guide talks a bit about philosophies for target setting as well.
Sure. So what we found in our research, we went through lots of different ins and outs of specific approaches. You saw the different types of methods that we could apply and agencies are applying. But really across these different methods, it became clear to us that practitioners and agencies tended to have sometimes very strong feelings about having a specific target setting philosophy. And so whatever method they're employing, whether it was forecasting and included explanatory factors or not, is that some agencies really want to be conservative. Someone mentioned not wanting to get that nasty gram from Federal Highway Administration. And so the goal is to set a more conservative target so that you will meet them and that you'll show to the public in leadership that you are meeting the targets you set. Another approach is to really try and be predictive and realistic about what you're going to set. And so, you would extrapolate that trend line, you would do the forecast, and then set your target where you expect it to be, maybe a slight improvement because it is a target where you're supposed to be doing better. And the language from FHWA has really indicated that they intended these to be somewhat predictive and to be used to assess where performance is likely to be heading. And then there is a very strong contingent of the industry who feels that targets, particularly because they're called targets, should be aspirational, that a target is not a prediction. And therefore, since we're calling them targets, they should reflect the agency's preference and values. And so each target should reflect a commitment to those improved outcomes. So you can go ahead to the next slide. What we found on these different target philosophies, there's, kind of pros and cons to a different, a more realistic and predictive approach versus an aspirational approach, which was the discussion that tended to come up a lot, was between those two poles. And, on the realistic side, you're looking more at the data and expected outcomes. So you're having conversations that are tied a little bit more closely to realistic assessments of interventions, what you can actually achieve with this or that program or intervention. And maybe you can do that deeper analysis into influencing factors, for example, to understand where your performance outcomes are coming from. And on the other side, though, the aspirational side does tend to be a lot easier to communicate, and it's a lot easier to align with your agency vision. And we just saw in the poll that, you know, ease of communication, and of course it's a simpler method to employ, is really important to a lot of practitioners out there. So it remains a very popular choice. On the kind of con side, the realistic side, there's that catch that it creates the appearance that the agency wants conditions to worsen because that term target has such connotations with it. Another side is that if you meet those targets, it can give folks a false sense of accomplishment. You know, the public sees that the agency is meeting the targets, but conditions are still worsening. And so does that get masks in the process? On the other hand, the aspirational side, you know, if everyone knows that you're not going to meet your targets and then the performance result comes in and you didn't meet your targets, does that take any kind of reaction out of it where you could kind of generate some interest in doing something? And so if you go to the next slide, the two that I skipped over here, on the realistic side was this thing that came up when we spoke with practitioners, that in some cases, agencies have been able to leverage dissatisfaction with worsening targets by leadership, by an MPO board, by the public, to really get what Deanna said was those deeper conversations about performance. You know, she mentioned having that safety conversation every year now because of this. And, you know, in a couple of cases with agencies we spoke with, it was almost like the wake-up call that some leadership and others needed and stakeholders needed to realize that performance really was getting worse and that they weren't meeting what they wanted to meet. And so having to force that issue, saying, here's what our target is because this is what we're expecting it to be, and the discomfort with that created some real conversations. On the other hand, you can have that on the aspirational side as well. Right? If there is that sting of missing your targets, that can also spur that same kind of conversation. And so there's heated debate on both sides of this issue. But I think what we really found is it goes back to what do you do with whichever one you choose, what do you do with the dissatisfaction with either not meeting your target or not being satisfied with your target? Are you going to use that discomfort? Are you going to use that opportunity to have the conversation with your leadership, with the public, to start taking action and to do something, change something in the way that you're going about trying to meet performance? So you can go ahead. I think, is this where we have a poll?
We certainly have some questions for folks. I did see also some comments coming in the chat while you were talking. And questions about aspirational targets and Federal Highway Administration discouraging use. I think our use of the word aspirational is used in a certain way that I think certainly saying next year we'll have 0 fatalities is not, you know, that is seen as kind of unrealistically aspirational. I think in some cases we were looking at some trends where even fatalities are increasing, and it looks like the trend isn't moving in the right direction, but we're going to aspire to reduce by a few percent below that. So in some cases, we consider that sort of an aspirational. It's somewhat real in the realm of realistic, but it's not the predictive sort of trend that we're seeing.
Speaking to David's comment, you know, I thought FHWA discouraged the use of aspirational targets, and I think that's true. I think the language, along with the TPM regulations we've seen, has always been, you know, these should be data driven, or the guidance that we've seen come out of that. But of course, Deanna just mentioned the NHTSA regulation that's now requiring that you can't set worsening safety targets for the ones that are also apply on their side. So there's that disconnect. And then there's the new greenhouse gas measure that is also looking like it could come with that requirement as well to not set worsening targets. And so we're definitely still in a place where there is not complete agreement on that. And despite FHWA's guidance on that, practitioners still feel very strongly that it should be improving. You just heard from some folks agreeing with that. So it's still a debate out there that the industry has not settled. I'm looking through some of the other comments, and I see a hand up. Mir, I think you have permission to speak if you'd like to unmute. Mir, did you want to say something? Okay. I see a comment here about data inconsistency always being a big issue.
And I think Deanna maybe, or Edgardo, did you want to add something?
I do. I wanted to add to what Anna said about the greenhouse gas measure, NPRM. And that's going to be really interesting because and now the cat has arrived, excuse me. So while we definitely want improving targets for that one, but it's going to be so interesting if we're required to set those. I would really like a lot of help on how we can reduce that. I mean, we have MnDOT has some strategies, some ideas, but guess what? It's going to cost a lot. We want to improve multimodal options. We want to provide so that people can get out of their cars, and that doesn't come, very cheap. So it's just a very rich and interesting time. But we'll see how the comments come out on that one.
Thanks, Deanna. And we have, Alan, your comment here that the early versions of MAP 21 were also calling for mandatory improving targets. That's a very interesting point. We could have been in a very different landscape if that was the case. And I'm wondering if other folks out there have strong feelings about a philosophy that your agency holds, or I think we saw with both our presenters that there were different philosophies for different performance areas. And I love that each of you really dug into that second bullet there, which is why might you choose one philosophy for one area, but a different one for another area? And I think a lot of it came down to, how much of an impact on the results can you have? How able are you to actually forecast it or understand the influences there? I'm curious if anyone has any other thoughts on that. I think Cynthia, is that there with your hand up? Are you able to? I think you can go ahead and speak if you'd like to.
Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Awesome. Thank you. And I'm from Maryland, so the comment I'm going to make is politically motivated. I work at an MPO, so of course we have our board that are elected officials, and they never want to see anything that's not aspirational, even though we're conservatively aspirational, like you were saying before. If it's a downward trend, we extend it. If it's an upward trend, we apply a couple percentage point reduction just to say, because we want to strive to do better. But we're also the only state, I still believe, we're definitely the first, that our state legislature deemed us a Vision Zero state. So they determined on that political level for us to always be aspirational, and it's not just a DOT decision or Secretary of Transportation, like it was all through law and all of that stuff. So I understand, and I'm a statistician, so setting these targets, there's all these different ways, but then sometimes you can present them all and still have someone say, but I don't accept a single loss of life, therefore I'm the board, I'm the legislator, I'm the president of the Senate, like I need to set aspirational. And then what do you say?
Yeah, when it comes down to it, you might have to do that. I'd like to know how many of those folks, if any of them also voted to increase speed limits anywhere, which we know will result in loss of life. But that's a debate for another day.
Gone, right? Consistency.
Exactly. Yeah. So I'm curious, Cynthia, we can recognize the political motives there, but as a practitioner, as a statistician, have you noticed that that requirement has either hindered conversation or helped it, or helped get people on board, one or the other?
The requirement that the targets not be declining, or
That's right.
yeah. So I mean, it's very hard on an area you don't control much. I was bringing up the jurisdiction issue, or in the case of highway safety, driver behavior is very hard for us to directly control. I mean, unless we're completely totalitarian in some strange way, and then expect, and those are yearly targets. That means that if you don't make progress, there's a temptation to change course, and these things may take quite a bit of time to pan out. And that's one component I would like to see to declining targets. Well, let's have something that matches the investment that you can make on these. So, and to let a strategy play out. I mean, changing every year because you didn't meet the target is just, it seems like the wrong outcome in it, but I could see a probability of that happening in some cases.
Yeah, thanks, Ed. Yeah, so I think bottom line, there's still wildly different philosophies out there. They're still influencing our target setting choices, and I think it's going to be interesting to see how that continues and pans out into the future with different requirements on different measures, different states having different requirements. And I'd be curious to hear over this next performance period and leading into the time after this, if anyone is able to either make use of one direction or another, or if there's one that tends to result in better conversations and better outcomes. And I'm going to take this moment just because I think I have another moment or so, and I have the soapbox here. I want to piggyback on something that Ed had brought up about not having a lot of control over results. And I think this also goes along with a general philosophy about targets of, right now our mindset is very much, we should set targets for our sphere. But as we all know, our sphere is increasingly getting complex and growing. And, eventually, it may, I'm so interested to see all of us moving toward that systems approach, even where we can't all affect the outcome directly. And we might be having to enter a phase of much more collaborative target setting, and where maybe this is an exercise that we truly are doing in coordination with each other to get the kind of outcomes that we need, because we know that DOTs are limited in what you can do to improve reliability or improve safety outcomes. So also very interested to see that philosophy grow and hear if anyone has had some really good collaborations like that.
So, well, I'll echo the fact that cross-functional impacts and collaborations is highly necessary. It even came up as one of the comments. Hey, you may improve reliability, but you may impact another measure the wrong way. But I think the systems, or at least a predictive explanatory model, but the systems approach allows you to look at and simulate and look at the interplay of a complex system from the inside. That's very hard to do with any other kind of technique.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's going to be an evolution in mindset, philosophy, and thinking about it, but I'm pretty excited. Yeah, as Cynthia's mentioned, the safe system approach, very multidisciplinary, recognizes those safety issues. Michael, I think I can hand it back to you.
That sounds good. We're getting towards the wrap up here, and we do have a few other things that came out of the guide and the research on tips for selecting a method. I think we have one other poll that we'll pull up though. First, Sarah, if you want to just pull that up. And just ask some questions about which methods folks here have felt to be most effective. Sarah, does this give people an opportunity to select more than one, or they, I can't recall if they have to select one or can select more than one?
Yes, you can select as many as you want.
Okay. Well, we asked for what's most effective, so don't select everything. But if you found, maybe up to 2 of these as very effective in your organization, that would be. I think we didn't limit you to necessarily just having to select one method. But we'll give you a minute or just 30 seconds to think about that and what methods you're using and what you've found effective. We'd like to see your responses on that. Okay, so we'll give a few more seconds on that and think about where really of all these types of methods. And again, this may differ based on different types of performance areas a bit, but in general, how you tend to approach target setting. So I think we've gotten our responses. Why don't we share the results of the poll here? And I see the largest set here are, really have indicated that historical trends and using the data from recent years and looking at those trends has been, they've found to be most effective. And I don't know if Anna, you have any observations on that. We noted that was generally one of the fairly simple methods, yet data driven. So maybe that sort of leads towards an understanding of issues, but without as much complexity as some of the more complex methods.
Yeah, I think historical trend projections, extrapolation really still tends to be the most common one out there. And in fact, what we found, during research, we kind of compared how predictive could you be with just simple trend line analysis versus trying to get those influencing factors in. And honestly, it's hard to beat a historical trend sometimes. You get pretty close with different approaches. So it's going to remain, I think, a popular one.
Okay, great. Oh, Edgardo, did you want to add?
I will have a soapbox. I mean, I will use them and they're very useful to actually think about the problem. I find, especially with something like the pandemic, but other trends, that you need to check your assumptions if you're going to keep using the data all lumped in together. So that's why the models tend to be, at least it has a checklist of variables to check that explain performance. So with the historical ones, if you we had a discussion on an adjustment period prior to the pandemic, and so system performance didn't show anything, and how to treat it after is different in terms of, for example, the things that happen with telework and e-commerce and the patterns of travel, the ones that have stuck in a different place. So all of a sudden, if you're in a new paradigm, the old data is very difficult to use. If not, you kind of have to go post or pre in determining one thing or another.
Yeah, that's a great point. I think, and then I'll make the plug for some of the content in our guide. We make that point that yes, if you're going to use historical trend, it comes with the assumption that past trends will continue into the future. And if you don't believe that to be true, do not use it. We also have a section in the guide to discuss specifically disruptions, such as the COVID-19 pandemic, to your historical trends and some different approaches you can use to work around that if you are using a trend approach.
Great. So it's interesting to see what people think of as effective methods. The guide and through the research, we just identified a few tips for how to consider selecting a method. We did highlight here, understand the complexity of the methods. The more complex methods that account for more explanatory factors can be extremely helpful and very valuable to understand the issues that are really influencing performance and the levers, as folks talked about. At the same time, they require forecasting more factors. They can add some additional layers of uncertainty if those factors are uncertain themselves. And so when selecting a method, it's important to weigh the different costs and trade-offs of gathering and additional data against those benefits. I think the key thing is weighing, kind of understanding how the agency can benefit from that additional analysis. Another approach we saw is really, I think many are already doing this, is really combining the results of multiple methods. Some places use a trend analysis with a more complex analysis, and we saw some examples of that. In the guide, we note that North Carolina DOT, for instance, initially had developed targets for reliability using a combination of trend line analysis as well as a risk-based approach by looking at the range of monthly average LOTTR values, or the level of travel time reliability values, to consider bounds for their target range. And then also considered how many roadway segments were at risk of changing from reliable to unreliable. Similarly, at the MPO level, we saw in the National Capital Region, the Transportation Planning Board, the MPO for the Washington, D.C. region, looked at for traffic congestion measure, for the urbanized area measures that were coordinated with the states. And for the non-SOV mode share target, they used both data from the, for the non-SOV from the American Community Survey based on trend line, as well as using the region's travel model to forecast what changes they may expect from different investments and sort of land different changes based on their model analysis, and then tried to average out the results. So having multiple methods gives you more information to help inform what might be a valuable target to set. And then we noted here, learn from past experience and experience of others. I mean, certainly agencies that have been through the process, and now all the agencies have been through, and the mid-period performance reports, there's an opportunity to revisit not only the target, but the approach that's been used, and whether the explanatory factors that might have been considered in the initial target setting are still relevant, or whether new issues should be incorporated into that. And we have an example noted that South Carolina Department of Transportation, for its safety targets, initially set targets using a regression model with VMT as or vehicle miles traveled as an explanatory factor, but over time didn't see as much clear relationship between the VMT and the fatality and the safety measures, and so switched to more of a trend analysis with additional considerations as part of that. So there's always learning or opportunities here to kind of adjust the approaches. We also just to note here the idea of connecting short-term targets to longer-term aspirations, and so this is the idea of aligning your goals, your long-term goals with the short-term targets, leveraging the target setting process itself to create opportunities for dialogue and engagement about not only what that target number is, but how that can lead into discussions about the causes of performance outcomes and the causes and the solutions, and what are the policies and investments that could change that performance. And then leveraging dissatisfaction with worsening performance. This can help to create a shared responsibility, particularly for measures that, as noted here, DOTs don't control all roadways and don't have, the transportation agencies don't have total influence over the issues and factors that affect performance. But this could be a way to engage new partners, address different types of issues relating to, as Anna, you mentioned, speed limits and other types of policies that may be affecting these kinds of performance outcomes. We also know kind of ground measures and targets in the most meaningful form. Some states, and we saw this here, have used their own performance measures in addition to the national measures. And that may be most useful for sort of translating the information into something that's useful for the agency. And then, similar to it noted earlier, continually improve and make adjustments to the process. So those were just some of the lessons we highlighted. We'd love to hear if you've found other lessons or what you've found to be important to ensure that the target setting process is adding value. We're towards the end of the time in our session, but happy to take a few comments if there are others who have lessons to share or want to add to the chat. This is a great opportunity to learn from each other. And Edgardo, I see you first have a comment.
I just a quick comment on those mid-performance. We have a yearly meeting about the data, and it's very nice to get into a yearly cycle, and I highly recommend that for everybody to know that, oh, it's August, it's time to look at performance with all the other things we do.
Okay, great. Are there any others who want to just highlight what you found helps to add value to the target setting process? Do other agencies, I think many do have, or some do beyond the 2-year or the cycle, have more periodic meetings to talk about some of these issues as well? Okay, I'm not seeing any direct comments, but I do see a question, or it maybe came up earlier. Is it good to repeat history? But I'm not sure. Maybe I missed part of the conversation. Is that related to the trends?
I think it was. Yeah, I think that
Okay.
came up then.
That there may be different ways of doing things than the historical way of doing things.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, well, we hope this dialogue was helpful to you and that you learned some things from this. We will highlight a few resources here now that I'll just bring up, and sort of next steps for folks to further this dialogue. As we noted, this is the last of a series of web-based workshops that we've had as a course of this NCHRP project. The recordings are available from the previous sessions at the AASHTO TPM portal. So feel free to listen to any of those presentations and dialogues about specific performance areas. This one as well will be posted up on the portal, and we'd encourage you to benefit from that. We are going through the pre-publication process with the National Cooperative Highway Research Program, Transportation Research Board, and hope to have a pre-publication version of the guidebook out, but it will likely take another month to 2 before that becomes available. Just simply going through their internal vetting and review process. We did want to note, in addition to these web-based forums, we have 2 in-person workshops that are planned, and it will be great opportunities to engage in person in some more dialogue about target setting. There's one session that's scheduled at the AMPO conference, the Association of Metropolitan Planning Organizations, which will be held, Deanna, in your state of Minnesota, in Minneapolis in October. We also have another one, not exactly in Connecticut, but in Rhode Island. Excuse me, I'm losing my voice. In Rhode Island, in Providence, and we're working with AASHTO to determine the specific date, but hoping to have that as part of the Conference on Performance-Based Management Planning and Data coming up in December. So hope to see some of you there at one of those venues, and learn from others in the industry about experiences with target setting. And Anna, why don't you talk about this as well?
Sure. So Making Targets Matter is a project that started a few years back, and Michael and his ICF team was part of our team to get that going. And the guide is now published. So we've been talking about it for a while now. A lot of you have probably heard about it. The guide is out there on NCHRP's website, so you can go ahead and grab that. There are some videos you can watch as well. And we are doing a new round of peer exchanges under that project. So if you enjoy talking about performance measures, but most importantly, targets, how you make those targets more meaningful. That's the connection point with this project and the Making Targets Matter project, is how do you make that process meaningful? How do you make the most of it to see some change? Come and talk with us. Come see some colleagues, and all expenses will be paid. We are still planning to do it in person in the fall of 2022. I think we just planned one for Baltimore, and we are in discussions for where the other 2 might be. So happy to hear from folks if you're interested.
Great. And I see a comment to put the conference opportunities in the chat. So I don't know if Sarah, you can also copy that out, or we'll also make this the slide information available, but I'll bring that back up just for a second for folks who want to jot that down. And I hope we can add that to the chat, as well as it sounds like, Anna, if folks are interested in participating in those Making Targets Matter peer exchanges, I'm sorry, should they contact you directly to sign up, or
contact me directly.
Okay.
I'll also drop the link to the new publication in the chat.
Okay. Well, that pretty much covers our session today. We have more information on this NCHRP project. There's a link. You can also just search online for the NCHRP project 2307. And as I said, the guidebook is for this project is not yet available on that site, but will be in the future. And we're working with TRB to get that through the review and evaluation process as quickly as possible. With that, I really just like to thank our presenters and for all of you for engaging in a great conversation today. So thank you very much. And we hope all of this information was valuable to you. And we always learn from each other. And so it's great to have these opportunities. Thank you very much.
Thank you. To be here. Take care.
Thank you.